Until the introduction of agriculture roughly 10,000 years ago, grains were virtually non-existent in the human diet. But since that time, the cultivation of wheat has literally enabled civilization to flourish. In Roman times, wheat was the primary fuel that powered the Roman army, and every man in the Republic was entitled to a wheat dole, equivalent to more than 3,000 calories a day. Bread's been considered a staple food for thousands of years, and today, wheat is one of the most widely consumed foods in the world. So how can something so pivotal to human civilization actually be bad for us? As hunter-gatherers, we evolved over a couple of million years on a diet of fruits and berries, seeds and nuts, leaves and roots, fish, and occasionally meat when we could catch it. When grains and wheat first started to be consumed, quite recently from an evolutionary perspective, some people weren't able to adapt to this new food category. Celiac disease is a condition that occurs in genetically susceptible individuals whereby gluten, a protein component found in wheat, rye, and barley, triggers an autoimmune reaction that can damage the lining of the small intestine, leading to symptoms such as abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, weight loss, and eventually malnutrition. Prior to the millennium, the prevailing medical opinion was that celiac disease was a very rare disorder, but we've since learned that celiac disease is in fact one of the most common genetic diseases of humankind, affecting almost 1% of the population. People diagnosed with celiac disease have literally only one treatment option: the total exclusion of gluten from their diet. But as anyone with celiac disease will tell you, that's easier said than done, since today, on top of the obvious culprits like cereals and pasta and bread, gluten can be found in almost everything from sausages and beer to soy sauce, salad dressings, and even some cosmetics, not to mention foods that don't otherwise contain gluten but may have been contaminated in the factory. Now, you might think a tiny bit of wheat contamination, what's the big deal? But make no mistake, for celiac sufferers, it only takes trace amounts of gluten to cause harm. But it still begs the question, if less than 1% of the population test positive for celiac disease, why is going gluten-free such a popular trend today? It's estimated that nearly 10% of the UK population avoid gluten, and the numbers are pretty similar in the States and Australia. So what actually is gluten, and why all the fuss? Well, let me back up a bit first and discuss grains as a whole. Grains are essentially seeds from cereal grasses, which evolved to survive from season to season. And so grains can be easily transported and stored for long periods of time without spoiling, which is why humanity has grown so dependent on grains for the majority of its food supply. Wheat, rice, corn, these are all basically types of grasses. Now, wheat was the earliest recorded grain to be cultivated, and it's a staple food for more than a third of the world's population. And when we look at its macronutrient profile, we find that wheat is made up of mostly starchy carbohydrate, with only around 10 to 12% protein. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but believe it or not, wheat actually provides more protein to the planet than any other food. And although there are hundreds of different proteins found in wheat, 80% of the protein content comes from two specific protein molecules, gliadin and glutenin, and these combine to form what we call gluten. So how do we digest the protein in our food? Well, in order to digest protein, we make stomach acid and enzymes that break down the protein into amino acids that can be then absorbed into the bloodstream and used by our body to build things like hormones and neurotransmitters, muscle tissue, cartilage, and literally every cell in our body. But as far as proteins go, and there are tens of thousands of different proteins, gluten is a very difficult protein for humans to digest. And that's because gliadin, a large component of gluten, is resistant to our digestive enzymes. In fact, humans literally can't digest gluten completely, so it can remain largely intact as it moves through the gut and the small intestine, where we absorb all the nutrients from our food. And this is where the problem with gluten begins. Now, you can think of the small intestine as a long tube, and on the inside of the tube is our food, and on the other side of the tube is our bloodstream. And the layer of cells that line the small intestine, known as the epithelial barrier, is only 1 cell thick. And these cells have to maintain tight junctions between themselves so that they can absorb individual nutrients into the bloodstream, while at the same time preventing whole food particles, bacteria, and other toxins from entering the bloodstream. And what we know is that in both celiac and non-celiac individuals, in other words, 100% of the human population, gluten, or more specifically gliadin, triggers the release of a substance called zonulin from our gut cells, which acts on the tight junctions and opens them up a tiny bit, causing what we know to be intestinal permeability, more commonly known as leaky gut. Now remember that layer of cells between the food and the blood is only one cell thick, and the problem begins when undigested gluten leaks into the bloodstream, activating a protective response from our immune system in the form of inflammation and the production of specific antibodies, whose job it is to seek out any gluten molecules in the blood, tagging them for destruction by other cells from our immune system. And it's this mechanism that links gluten to the development of a number of autoimmune diseases, like celiac disease, in genetically susceptible people. But why does this actually happen? Well, amino acids are the fundamental building blocks of all proteins in our body. There are about 20 of them in humans, and the sequence of how they're arranged determines the type of protein. Now, gluten is a protein that has a very similar amino acid sequence to certain proteins found in the human body. And as a result, it can trigger the production of autoantibodies that can cause injury to our own tissues, leading to autoimmune diseases such as celiac disease. In fact, there are over 160 diseases that have now been linked to gluten. And we now know that there's a spectrum of gluten-related disorders beyond celiac disease, referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And the symptoms can mimic those of celiac disease, but without the autoimmune response and the subsequent tissue damage to the gut lining and potentially other tissues in the body. And we're not just talking about gut symptoms. Most of the symptoms from non-celiac gluten sensitivity are actually outside of the gut, with things such as eczema, joint pain, muscle weakness, fatigue, headaches, brain fog, depression, and anemia. And considering these non-gut symptoms can often be subtle and can take up to 3 days to occur after eating gluten, many people remain undiagnosed but have somehow figured out that they simply feel better when they don't eat gluten and worse when they do. So the question is, has this always been a problem, or is it a more recent phenomenon? Over the past century, so-called agricultural advances in crossbreeding have resulted in thousands of varieties of wheat being developed that deliver higher yields. In fact, today the world produces 440% more wheat per acre than it did just 100 years ago. But one of the so-called advances in these more recent varieties is a higher protein content. In other words, we find much more gluten in today's wheat than the varieties that were grown in the last century, such as spelt and kamut wheat. And that might be why some of these newer wheat breeds have been shown to trigger a greater immune response, and why some people that are gluten sensitive can better tolerate these more ancient grains. We're also finding that our gut bacteria has a role to play as well. The human gut is home to an estimated 100 trillion bacteria that we collectively call the microbiome, and a huge amount of research is going on into understanding the role that these organisms play in human health and disease. We have identified thousands of different species of beneficial bacteria that inhabit the gut, and many play an important role in digestion. One such species is bifidobacteria, which is one of the more dominant species in the gut, and certain strains of bifidobacteria can actually produce the enzymes that we lack that help to better digest gluten. And in this way, healthy populations of bifidobacteria in the gut have been shown to protect the gut lining by reducing the inflammation that can occur when gluten is consumed, limiting the release of zonulin, and potentially reducing the instances of leaky gut and minimizing the subsequent response from the immune system. And this might explain why some people can better tolerate gluten than others. And we know that the populations of bifidobacteria in the human gut are in decline from things like the increasing use of chemical pesticides and herbicides in agriculture, the consumption of artificial sweeteners, the long-standing overuse of antibiotics, and also the decreasing rates of breastfeeding, which is critical to establishing healthy levels of bifidobacteria in the gut. So with all these factors at play, it's no wonder so many people are finding that their health improves when they avoid gluten. And with so much gluten-free choice out there in restaurants and supermarkets, it's certainly easier being gluten-free today than it was just a couple of decades ago. But it's important to remember, just because a food might claim to be gluten-free doesn't mean it's a health food. In fact, so much of the gluten-free food you can buy at the supermarket is nothing more than ultra-processed junk food. This is why it's a good habit to look at the label before you put a packaged food in your shopping cart. If there are more than 5 ingredients, and many of those ingredients are substances that you don't recognize as food, consider putting it back on the shelf. Keep in mind that all fruits and vegetables are gluten-free. All beans and pulses and nuts and seeds are gluten-free. All organic, pasture-raised eggs, meat, and poultry and wild fish are gluten-free. I like to say that the safest place to be in the grocery store is in the outer perimeter. This is where we find most of the fresh foods that are more in line with our ancestral nutrition. And I try and fill 80% of my shopping cart with these foods. It's when we venture into those inner aisles where we find all the boxes and cans and packaging that food can start to look less and less like food. And I don't know about you, I just think that the less my food touches a factory, the better. If you'd like to learn more about nutrition and how the food you eat can affect your health, check out some of our short courses at CNM. Link in the description below. So in summary, just because gluten and wheat is a staple food in these times doesn't mean we evolved eating it, and it's certainly not essential for life. So if you found that you just feel better avoiding gluten, then good on you. But just be wary of all the gluten-free processed food out there today. Check the labels and always look at the ingredients to avoid foods with loads of E numbers and additives that are used in many of these gluten-free foods. And for some individuals, their tolerance of gluten is much lower, so even a little exposure can cause symptoms. So if you need to be strict, that's another reason to keep a close eye on labels, avoiding anything that contains wheat, rye, or barley. And the more of your shopping cart you can fill up with fresh produce, the better. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.